Haakon Aasprong is a Ph.D. candidate at the Department of Social Anthropology at NTNU, and he's currently carrying out research on the use of private standards and certification systems in the small grower-dominated banana industry of St. Vincent in the Eastern Caribbean. And his talk takes a historic approach to how the Vincentian banana industry has been using certification systems as a survival strategy in a liberalized global market economy. And more generally, he's addressing the difficulties with certification-based approaches in smallholder agriculture. So please, Haakon, take the floor for today's final presentation.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here with so many distinguished speakers. I hope you can stay awake through this final presentation. I think I'll try to stick to my script because I've got quite a bit to go through. I am an anthropologist, although today I may sound a bit like a historian. I did fieldwork in St. Vincent in 2008 and 2009. But what I'll try to do today is give you is to try and trace a historical development, or give you an outline of what appears to have been the breakdown of an almost 250 years old trade relationship between St. Vincent and Britain. I'll try and show you how this relationship evolved through three phases. First, the phase of colonial extraction, lasting from the time that Britain gained possession over St. Vincent in 1763 till the end of the 19th century, followed by a phase characterized by a discourse of development and colonial obligation toward the small grower that lasted up until the 1990s. And at this point, there was a transition to the period in which we find ourselves now, a period of trade liberalization and private re-regulation of production and trade through standards and certification systems. It appears, however, that in the case of St. Vincent, the adoption of such technologies has been insufficient to prop up the banana industry, which was a driver of development through much of the latter half of the 20th century. With Philip McMichael here today, I feel like I should have tried to relate this to food regime theory, but I'm afraid I'm not sufficiently well-read to do that this time around. And anyway, there's probably no time. But before I begin, I'll show you St. Vincent on the map. Is that tiny speck there? It's located west of Barbados and north of Grenada and Trinidad. It's the main island of the multi-island state St. Vincent and the Grenadines, which is one of the smallest states in the world, both in terms of land mass and population. Excuse me if I'm a little bit hoarse, but I'm probably under a microbial attack right now. Okay, so this trade relationship started with sugar. Well, economically speaking, St. Vincent has, since it came under British rule in 1763, relied heavily on agricultural exports. But at first, it was a source of sugar for Britain, which is why it was colonized in the first place. In the process of transforming St. Vincent into a sugar island, the British dramatically altered the population as well as the landscapes. And they deported the pre-existing population of Caribs. Those were probably a mix of Amerindians and African slaves who had escaped from other islands. These were deported since they did not simply peacefully comply with having their lands taken away from them to British Honduras, what is today Belize. Most Vincentians today will self-identify as being of African origin. They're the descendants of the slaves who were brought in to work on the plantations. Although there are minorities who are descendants of indentured laborers, that is, who arrived after slavery was abolished, from India and Madeira. Sugar enjoyed a fairly short heyday in St. Vincent before going into decline when European markets were flooded with cheaper sugar from other origins, including French beet sugar. Along with the decline of sugar followed the search for other export crops, although this search was led by the small growers rather than the often absentee or recalcitrant planters. Right. So in 1898, and this takes us to the second phase, the Imperial Department of Agriculture was established in Barbados, encouraging small farmers in the colonies to attain lands and export cash crops. And this marked a shift in colonial policy, instituting a development discourse. In the first half of the 20th century, Vincentian small farmers successfully produced and exported cotton and arrowroot to Britain, and particularly the latter crop was well suited for a small grower setup, although what you see here is an arrowroot plantation on the left. And those are bales of cotton being shipped out on top, and what you see on the bottom is bananas. Bananas. The arrowroot could not compete with the popularity of bananas among the small growers when the British company Geest, encouraged by the British government in 1954, signed a contract agreeing to buy all bananas of exportable quality from the 4 Windward Islands, that is St. Vincent, Grenada, St. Lucia, and Dominica. This set off a banana boom, since the benefits that the banana could offer small growers were many. The income was higher than for alternative crops, and it was regular, bananas being harvested either weekly or bi-weekly. Moreover, the crop was suitable for hilly as well as flat lands, and besides access to land, the crop required little in terms of capital outlay. Finally, many were already familiar with banana farming, bananas being a local staple. A lot can be said about the subsequent ups and downs of the banana industry, but we have to make do with a short sketch here. Following the initial upswing and optimism of the 1950s, which came as a result of a number of favorable circumstances over which St. Vincent had little or no control, came several setbacks. The geographer Lawrence Grossman, who has written extensively about banana farming in St. Vincent, described the Windward Islands banana industries as, apart from brief flickers of prosperity, having limped from crisis to crisis. Its extreme vulnerability to external shocks stands out. Being situated in the hurricane belt, there are of course the storms to contend with. But St. Vincent has also suffered from drought and various banana pests and diseases. The dominance of small growers, moreover, has made it difficult for the industry as a whole to adapt to changing circumstances, while administrative and logistical costs are high compared to the Latin American plantations, which constitute the primary competition in the marketplace. Add to this that the relative costs of labor have been much higher in the Windwards than in Latin America, and that the rugged volcanic terrain has ruled out any significant degree of mechanization. And the poor competitive footing of the industry should be readily apparent. Meanwhile, the marketing company Geest, as the sole link to the UK market, used contracts to effectively insulate itself from economic risk, this risk being passed on to the banana growers and their associations. For these reasons, banana farming in St. Vincent and the Windward Islands more generally relied on a protected market in Britain. The so-called dollar bananas from Latin America were subject to tariffs and import quotas, where Commonwealth bananas enjoyed free access. But they also relied on the willingness of Britain to supply financial aid through a series of development packages in times of trouble. This aid was forthcoming, though always with the insistence on its temporary nature and its objective of helping to foster a robust and competitive banana industry. That industry never materialized, and it's hard to accept that British authorities truly believed that it could materialize. Rather, the aid should probably also be understood as an indirect subsidization of yeast, as it allowed the company to carry out its business in the Windward Islands without paying producers a price which reflected the true cost of production. The boom of the 1950s had brought scores of small growers into the banana industry, and by the end of the decade, banana exports were the backbone of St. Vincent's economy. British aid and preferential treatment then allowed for the industry's survival until the next boom, which followed in the late 1980s, when factors once again aligned in favor of the Windward Islands. More growers were attracted and could share in unprecedented levels of prosperity, but at the same time, this deepened St. Vincent's and the other islands' dependence on what was now referred to as green gold. In St. Vincent in 1990, bananas were grown on 40% of all agricultural land, constituting more than half of the total exports and a quarter of the gross domestic product. In the decline that was to follow, and which has lasted until present day, people in the islands have always remembered vividly the wealth that the banana could provide. The 1990s marked a turning point in St. Vincent's banana industry for two interrelated reasons. First, the future of preferential access to the British market and consequently the economic viability of the banana industry was again cast in doubt as European integration deepened with the establishment of the single European market and a common banana regime in 1992. This was also the start of a long-running trade dispute, sometimes referred to as the Banana Wars, only resolved with the signing in 2009 of the Geneva Banana Agreement. Time doesn't allow me to go into that, but it needs to be remembered that from the vantage point of St. Vincent and the Windward Islands, the prospect of imminent erosion of trade preferences loomed on the horizon throughout this period, creating uncertainty and a call for proactive action. Second, and more importantly in this context, the 1990s was the decade when the British supermarket retailers began to engage closely with their supply chains through the use of standards, auditing, and certification technology. Where the international agreements under the WTO pressured nation states to do away with legislation acting as technical barriers to trade, nothing prevented private actors from re-regulating. Indeed, British supermarkets were encouraged to do so by the UK Food Safety Act of 1990, which demanded that retailers exercise due diligence in ensuring food safety. So in practice, this led to the institution of quality assurance and risk mitigation programs, which extended to suppliers. At the same time, social movement organizations were exploring the use of food labeling systems to differentiate products with respect to social and or environmental criteria, making it possible to channel ethical consumerism through mainstream outlets. These developments promised to drastically reshape the playing field for Windward Island bananas, introducing new challenges as well as opportunities, but clearly demanding some kind of collective and organized response. It is possible to identify three broad strategies which, with associated discourses which were advocated and employed during this period. The first strategy was to fight for the status quo and resist regulatory change by lobbying London and Brussels against trade liberalization, an endeavor in which politicians, industry officials, and producer representatives all took part in, and in which they were aided by British NGOs. It was argued that because the islands depended so heavily on banana exports, the loss of trade preferences would spell social disaster. The second strategy was to appeal to British consumers' sense of loyalty and to implore them to continue to choose Windward Island bananas when shopping. These were promoted for their ethical track record and for their role in raising the standard of living in the islands. Conversely, Latin American plantations were derided for their appalling treatment of workers and detrimental impact on the environment. The third strategy was one of commercialization and professionalization. While no one harbored the illusion that the Windward Islands would be able to produce bananas on the same scale and at the same low costs as Latin American producers, industry officials, as well as foreign consultants and donors, clearly believed that there was room for improvement with respect to productivity as well as quality. Commercialization required reforms in order to bring about a finer attunement to market demands, less government interference in the industry, and a professionalization of the grower base. The rationale was that without protection in the British market, there could be no protection of producers at home. Only an industry with progressive and business-minded growers at its core could hope to stay afloat in a liberalized market. Importantly, the choice of a path forward was more than a choice of strategy. It was also a matter of adopting a governance structure to realize the desired objectives, whatever they were. And while actors in the banana industry disagreed on the level of strategy, they all seemed to agree that continued market access to Britain demanded the implementation of one or more sets of certification systems. While the growers themselves, through their own Farmers Association, WINFA, began exploring the feasibility of some kind of fair trade certification, at the time pioneered in the Netherlands, foreign consultants who were hired to advise politicians and industry officials on the restructuring exercise encouraged the implementation of a grower certification system tailored to meet the requirements of British retailers. Such a certification system would enable a refocusing of the industry on what they deemed to be the progressive producers, and at the same time reassure retailers of the industry's commitment to high standards. Remarkably, these two approaches to certification were advocated and pursued by sets of actors with quite different ideas about the way forward, ended up being implemented in parallel, apparently ignoring the underlying frictions resulting from their different conceptualizations of farming and agriculture. And the most obvious tension here relates to the associated discourses on the marginal farmers, the most exposed farmers. In 1994, a new entity, WIBDECO, was established. This was co-owned by the Windward Island governments and producer organizations. And the following year, in a joint venture with Fives, WIBDECO managed to acquire Geest's banana division, taking over as the exclusive exporter and marketer of Windward Island bananas in Britain. In 1996, this new exporter implemented its own Certified Growers Program, a certification system building on notions of integrated crop management and integrated pest management, prescribing good agronomic practices. But this was also a direct outcome of the restructuring undertaken in the name of rationalization and intended to streamline the grower base. At the time of implementation, banana exports from St. Vincent had dropped dramatically since they peaked in 1992, and a great many growers had already left the industry. This certification program did nothing to encourage those growers to come back, but rather sought to stimulate production by rewarding the growers whose bananas constantly received high quality scores under inspections. Now, initially, the program seemed successful in this respect, but it was then abandoned after a few years following disagreements within the industry. And in 2004, it was replaced at the request of WIBDECO's British clients, it's just eye candy really, by what is today known as Global Gap, a farm assurance certification system devised by a consortium of major European retailers and some of their suppliers. And while Global Gap was primarily devised as a generic food safety risk mitigation tool and therefore not as intimately tied up with the rhetoric of rationalization, it certainly continued to disfavor many of the marginalized growers who had struggled to adapt to the changing requirements, many of which related to paperwork. Fair trade certification, on the other hand, had been implemented in 2000 in the hope that it would eventually encourage back destitute farmers who had long since given up on the struggle. And that last bit is a quote from a Fair Trade Foundation report. The Fair Trade Foundation being the British NGO which, along with WINFA, worked to realize fair trade exports. I can't go into the fair trade standards, but the scheme offers growers, as I'm sure many of you know, a guaranteed minimum price as well as a social premium designated to development projects. In return for growers' adherence to requirements detailing participation in democratic producer organizations and a commitment to social and environmental principles. Much to the surprise of many of the most ardent supporters of rationalization, there proved to be a consumer demand for fair trade bananas in Britain. And encouraged by this, WIBDECO began to push for a complete conversion of production to fair trade, creating a scenario where both Global Gap and fair trade certification became de facto market access requirements for growers to export to Britain. While fair trade appeared to be a resounding success in St. Vincent when looking at fair trade exports as a percentage of total exports, while fair trade appeared to be a resounding success in St. Vincent when looking at the percentage of fair trade exports as a percentage of total exports to Britain, it did not reverse the overall decline of the industry. And at best, this decline was slowed down. So, banana exports from St. Vincent to Britain ceased altogether following a double whammy of Hurricane Thomas in December 2010, with the subsequent appearance of and spread of black sigatoka, a fungus, the year after, just as crops were recovering. Well before that, however, there was a clear tendency that exports to the regional markets, that is mainly Barbados and Trinidad, where WIBDECO had no monopoly, were growing while exports to Britain continued to decline. Prior to the introduction of certification, the regional market had been a place to offload second-grade bananas, not considered exportable by yeast. With certification acting as a market entry barrier, however, farmers unable to certify found themselves relying on the regional market for all of their exports. These were growers who struggled with the ongoing record keeping or with keeping farm facilities up to standard. But I believe the key to the growth of regional exports was in its attraction to growers who either dismissed the received wisdom that the British market was where the best money was to be made, or who accepted that but who still felt that for reasons of pride, autonomy, or ideological conviction, they did not want to participate in fair trade meetings or subject themselves to any kind of certification or monitoring. The question of economy is too complicated to deal with properly here, but some growers were adamant that the costs of producing in line with fair trade environmental requirements, which include a ban on the use of herbicides, outweighed any additional income they received. Others argued that fair trade was likely to fail as a business strategy in the longer term since decision-making was too cumbersome to allow for timely and focused responses to challenges in the marketplace. This argument was voiced by some of the larger and more prominent growers, whom fair trade farmers would tell me were too proud to be part of any movement that they themselves were not in charge of. Indeed, in 2009, some of these more prominent growers set up their own marketing company, which targeted the regional market. The economic and ideological arguments seem to run together with a strong cultural estimation of autonomy, and several authors have suggested that this is a value orientation which is deeply rooted in the Caribbean, and that the independent banana farmer has enjoyed a certain admiration precisely because of the perceived freedom from supervision. The hired farm laborer, meanwhile, has suffered under a certain stigma, reflected in the professed difficulties growers have in recruiting sufficient labor to man their farms, despite the obvious availability of underemployed manpower in St. Vincent. By way of a provisional conclusion, I believe the introduction of certification as market entry barriers in the Vincentian banana industry, and there is no obvious difference between Global Gap and fair trade in this respect, has served to blur the distinction between the independent banana farmer and the dependent laborer. Along with the failure to unite around a vision of farming and agriculture and to pull in the same direction, this may go some way toward explaining the breakdown of this transatlantic trade tie. Now, whether this breakdown will turn out to be a bad thing or not, time will show. But that's a whole different and complicated question. Thank you.